So it's a bittersweet seventh and final. I know it's bittersweet. Obviously, because it's a Maharal, it has to end with the number 7, even though we planned for it to end with number 6. But I would have said that whatever number it was, that number is significant to the Maharal in its own way. So it is what it is. It happens to be that there was a piece of the history of the Maharal's life that I skipped over because it was not initially, to me, the most interesting thing about his life. And then when I started reading Ner Mitzvah, I had to express order Ner Mitzvah, which is the Maharal's essays on Hanukkah, which we'll be talking about tonight. I ordered it and I started reading it. And as you'll see, because of all the work that we put in, I said, oh, there's really good stuff here, but you have to know the Maharal to know what's really going on beneath the surface. And then it came all the way back to this most interesting piece of the Maharal's life and rabbinic legacy, which will allow us, I think, in some ways to come totally full circle. So Ner Mitzvah is essays from the Maharal Prague that were published, I think, at the very, very end of his life. We know most of the Maharal's writings weren't published until he was, the 1580s. So he's in his 60s, 70s, 80s, depending on when he was born, but they're relatively towards the end of his life. And I think this was published originally close to the year 1600. As far as Hanukkah books go, it is very unusual. Okay, it divides up into 2 halves. The first half of the book is not really about Hanukkah. I mean, it is and it isn't, but it's an essay called Inyanei Arba HaMalchiot. Right? We believe Chazal have this tradition that there are 4 historic enemies which the Jewish people face. And, we lose to number 1, we outlast them, we lose to number 2, we outlast them, we lose number 3, number 4, and then redemption happens. So the big question is, who are 1, 2, 3, and 4? When is Mashiach coming? So the Maharal has this whole essay about who the 4 Malchios are, which we're not going to discuss tonight. The third of which are the Yevanim, which is why it's published alongside his essays on Hanukkah. But that's part 1 of the book. That's essay number 1. Okay? Essay number 2 is actual things about Hanukkah. And what the Maharal does, if I'm not mistaken, it goes in this order. This is how I remember it. He starts out with a couple of interesting conceptual ideas about Hanukkah. He talks about Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel and what the relationship is between Yavan and Torah, all these things that are interesting to him, etc. And then he tangents off, or maybe not, and he talks about halachic issues. So this is incredibly significant because what the Maharal is doing is telling you a little bit of the concepts of Hanukkah. And then he says, once I'm writing about Hanukkah, I'm going to write halacha. What's the problem with the Maharal writing halacha? Anyone who's been paying attention all semester? Well, so when he writes halacha, it's going to be very hard to understand, right? It's not a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, right? Not at all. But the real issue is that he's very opposed to the codification of Jewish law. Remember, you could read any piece of Maharal and understand it, but I think we've made a very convincing case over the course of the semester. If you understand him well, so then you'll really get a better context for what he's talking about. So if you open up to page 2, the first page of Mar Makomos, and the handout, there's a lot of Hebrew tonight, and I apologize that there isn't much of a translation at all. Okay, this is when he transitions in Chelek Beis to talking about. You can see in Rabbi Hartman's fancy schmancy Maharal, it has those little subject lines on the side, Al Inyanei Halacha, right? So the Maharal is transitioning from conceptual, philosophical ideas about Hanukkah to talking about Jewish law as it relates to Hanukkah. Amar Yehuda ben la'adoni avi B'tzalel zichrono l'chai olam haba. So he's writing himself, right? This is autobiographical, I guess. So says the Maharal. HaMitzvah shekavu chachamim al hanes. Kidei lases hoda'a v'shevach el mi sha'asa lanu hanes. This mitzvah that the chachamim established on the miracle of Hanukkah in order to give thanks and praise to Hashem for the miracle that he did for us. Roi shetia nase b'shleimos hagamor. You've been following along from Maharal for the semester. What does Shleimus Hagamor mean? It's sloppy old 16th century Hebrew. What does Shleimus Hagamor mean? What is Shleimut, everybody? Something that's whole, right? And Gamor means totally, right? Shleimus Hagamor is an old-fashioned Hebrew way of just saying you should do the mitzvah really nicely. Sometimes Hashem gives you a mitzvah. Think about this. Sometimes Hashem gives you a mitzvah because, I don't know, Hashem told you have to do it. Okay, so some people do it better, some people do it worse, some people spend a lot of money, some people don't spend so much money. Then HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes out of his way. And on your behalf, God performs an incredible miracle. A miracle that's so incredible, we're going to remember it for all of Jewish history. And you go to the store and you say, I can't believe they charge $5 for this. It should only be $4.25. Right? I mean, you should be willing to spend. You should do it perfectly. You should do it b'shleimas hagamor. Ki hu yisbarach hifli imanu la'azos. Right? Look, and that's a quote from a pasuk. Look how amazing Hashem goes out of his way to perform this supernatural thing for us. Ve'ech lo nasa hamitzvah shekavu al zeh b'shleimas hagamor. How could you not invest properly in the mitzvah of hadlakas neros if Hashem did so much to help us defeat the Greeks? Umepnei ki ra'isi dvarim she'anu noagim ve'im tamuim alai. I see things that I don't like. I love this. I love everything about this introduction to his Hilchos Hanukkah. It's the most unusual halacha sefer you'll ever see. I see things that don't make any sense to me. Yesh lizkor osam. So he's going to mention them. Ve'a'ish hachacham ve'hanavon ve'umedaktek b'mitzvos yizbonein v'yivchar es asher nir elo. Which means anyone who's really wise, sounds like Yosef, Chacham V'Navon, for those who are holding in Parshat HaShavua, Ish HaChacham V'Navon, anyone who is wise and intelligent, and Midaktek B'Mitzvos, someone who does their mitzvos with detail, Yisbonein V'Yivchar Es Asher Nirelo, you could do as you see fit. What does that mean? It is the most unusual introduction to Hilchos Hanukkah I think you'll find anywhere. Subtle comment number one is you should probably care about this mitzvah. God cared enough about you to save you from the Greeks. The least you could do is be Mekayim the mitzvah properly. You could say, you really going to give a shear about whether you should start at Shkia or before Shkia, plag on Friday, Tzeis HaKocha. What's the difference? It's only a mitzvah d'Rabbanan anyway, right? So just light a menorah. Isn't that the point? Good enough? Electric, gas, can. What's the difference? Just do it. So he starts by saying every detail matters. But why does every detail matter? Not because it's Jewish law, but because it is a celebration of a miracle. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu was willing to upend all of the rules of science and nature in order to perform this miracle for you, the least you could do is commemorate it right once a year, which I think is very interesting. Okay? And then comment number two, he says, now, there's things people do on Hanukkah that I don't like. What does he mean there are things they do that I don't like? Halachically, right? Because he introduces it by saying we should observe the mitzvah correctly. So there are people who are observing the mitzvah of Hanukkah, but they're not really observing the mitzvah of Hanukkah correctly. So here's what I'm going to do. I'll put it down on a piece of paper. You can read it. If you like it, you could do it. If you don't like it, you don't have to do it. So anybody who doesn't know anything about the Maharal is thinking to themselves, what is this? Options? If you read Rabbi Harbin's footnotes, or if you come to this semester at the RJC, the answer is obvious. Right? The Maharal does not tell people what to do on halachic issues. I mean, he does, right? He certainly doesn't codify them in this way. And he's not going to publicize a book of Jewish law that also says everybody's doing it wrong, even though he thinks everybody's doing it wrong. So he introduces it with, and that's how Rabbi Hartman explains it in the footnotes at the bottom, which I underlined. We don't need to see them inside. That's exactly what he means. He said, there's this halacha. I don't like the way people are doing it. So I'm going to tell you, this is my opinion. If you read it, if you study the sugya, if you come to the same conclusion as I did, so then I think you should do it my way. And if not, so be it, which is just fantastic. Okay. Now, what the Maharal goes on to do in this little section of Ner Mitzvah is write down his opinion on 3 or 4, I don't remember exactly, 3 or 4 halachic issues. All of the 4 things that the Maharal writes, la halacha, are all things that we do not do and are all rejected by everyone else in Jewish law, which is amazing and perhaps the perfect way to end the semester. We could, if we were going to, we could just end the semester. Here are the 4 things about Hanukkah that the Maharal says you're doing wrong, and we could all graduate and go home for the winter. which would make a lot of sense. But I'll give you an example before we get to the example we're going to study. I'll give you an example, which is really fascinating. The Maharal believes that the mitzvah, as we all know, the mitzvah to light the menorah is when the Gemara says the menorah should be lit at what time? Right? You have to do it right during the transition time between day and night. Again, before Shkia, during Shkia, Ben Hashmash, 30 minutes, 42 minutes, whatever. So at some point during that Zman that people are walking home. What happens if you're still at work until what time is Shechla Regel Min Hashuk right now? So Shkia is at 4:20 something, 4:29 today, something like that. So you have till what? 5:15, 5:22, 5:37. What happens if you don't get home from work until 6? You light the menorah? Of course you do. Not according to the Maharal, you don't. He says you're going to go home at 10 o'clock at night and light a menorah with a bracha. It's a bracha l'batala. And he goes, no one paskins that. Everybody says you go home and you light the menorah, right? Certainly at like normal hours when people are still coming home. People were out on the streets in Prague, I'm sure too. But he says, no, you missed the window, it's over, which is really interesting. Here is by far the most interesting, the first unaccepted halakhic position of the Maharal on Hanukkah is number one. Ha'echad, because he counts them, but there's only a few of them. Number one, Masherov olam noagin la'asos neros shel sha'ava lahadlik bo. What do you use for your menorah, everybody? What? Some people said oil. Anybody want to admit that they're not using oil tonight? Heidi, I'm so glad Heidi came for the last year. Heidi uses candles, right? So Rova olam, he's talking about Heidi. I'm not picking on Heidi. Everybody in my house lights candles also. Masherov olam noagin lasos neros shel shava lahadlik bo. People make Hanukkah candles. Chutz min osam hamidachtigim lahadlik b'shem zayis. Except for like those frum guys who use oil. Remember, he says if you're medachtik in mitzvos, you should do what he says. So there are a few people out there that light oil. Everybody else is lighting candles. Since it's obviously supposed to be reminiscent of the menorah at the Beis Hamikdash, which did not use candles, so the medachtikim think they're being machmir and they're using oil. Everybody else is using candles. I'm on to the top of page 3. Right now I'm on the top of page 3. The numbers are in the bottom corner. If you can see it, it's very small. Ki lefi hanira shehu paso l'ner Chanukah ligamri delo nikra ner klal. Maharal is of the opinion that the word ner does not refer to candles. It refers to what? Not oil, but lights that are produced from sticking a wick into oil. What do you call that? There's got to be a word for it. I don't know what it is. Wicks in oil is what neros are. A ner is when you take a bowl of fuel and you put a wick in it that you could wiggle around and you float it like I did it tonight in my house and you light it. That's a ner. Rak zen nikra ner. See in the underlined section? And he doesn't have the sophisticated modern Hebrew language to articulate things in the way that we would like in Hebrew or English. Rak zen nikra ner shenosnin hashemen bikli. You take a bowl, you fill it with oil, umenichin sham hapsila, and you stick a wick into that. Shezen nikra ner. Lo kasher korchen hashav al hapsila. Not these people who take wax and they wrap it around wicks. Or chelev shekorchen al hapsila. Lav ner hu rak avuka. He says that halachically is not a ner. When the Gemara talks about an avuka, which means like a bonfire or a torch or something like that, he says that's when you make candles and all these things. Wicks in oil, like the neros in the Beis Hamikdash, that is what a ner is. And by the way, what does the Gemara say about avuka? I don't know why he thinks regular candles are called avuka, but vavuka nira de paso l'ner Hanukkah. You can't use it. Mida Amar Sham, the Gemara says in Shabbos in the Mai Hanukkah Gemara, Chavkim Lamabeis, Mile Kara Shemin V'Kifa Psilos, Kaf Alei Akli Ola Lakam Bnei Adam, Lo Kaf Alei Akli Asa Kimin Medura, V'Afilu Lecha Nami Ena Ola. So if you have a whole bunch of wicks all mixed together in one big bowl, and all the wicks get mixed together, it's not considered a candle anymore. It's considered a torch or a bonfire. You can't be yotze. Why can't I be yotze with one big bowl that has a bunch of wicks floating around in it? Halachically, you have to fulfill the mitzvah by lighting neros. Ner ishu beso. So what is a ner? It's not a candle. We can all agree to that. They didn't light candles in the Beis Hamikdash. So a ner refers to wicks that float in oil. If you're lighting a wick that floats in oil, you're yotzei the mitzvah. If you're lighting a candle that stands on its own, you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of ner Hanukkah. Hurak Medura, etc. The third line in the second column. Kasher korech shaval apsila lav ner hurak avuka ve'en avuka hu ner kidarmina b'medrash. There is a medrash. The medrash says, "Domim hatzadikim lifnei hashechina kener b'fnei ha'avuka." When the righteous stand before God's holy presence, it is like a candle standing in front of a big flame. Upirish zeh. This is what that medrash means. Ki hatzadikim yesh lahem neshama zaka. Righteous people have pure souls. Shenikra haneshama ner. Udechsev ner Hashem nishmas adam. The ein haneshama shehu haor shemekabel haguf milmala sholetes bechol haguf. And if you know what this means, then you know what the Maharal is talking about. He goes on to say it over and over for the next few pages, and I'm not going to read it to the end, but I gave you the first section. The candle, the flame, is representative of the soul, which means the fuel source is representative of, if it's not the soul, it has to be the body. It has to be the body. The ein haneshama shehu haor shemekabel haguf milmala, the soul, which is the light that is benefiting from the guf, sholetes bechol haguf. There needs to be, I think this is what he means, there needs to be a divide between the physical and the spiritual. There needs to always be division between the neshama and the guf. The way the Maharal conceptualizes the relationship between the oil wicks and the candle is that when you have the wick that floats in the oil, the two of them are separate from one another, right? If you pour it out, they fall apart. They're not attached, they're just touching, right? The oil is able to fuel the wick from beneath, even though the wick and the oil are not conjoined with one another, right? The ner, the way he describes it, which I believe is on purpose, is that it's wrapped around the wick. That's how he describes the candles, right? Karoch al hapsila. He uses it, lo kasher korchin hashava al hapsila. So the Maharal is doing two things at once here that are incredibly fascinating and rejected lahalacha. The first sounds like a very technical argument, right? You can only fulfill the mitzvah of ner Hanukkah with a ner. The best example of this I can give, because it happened, I remember having this discussion in my childhood at some point. People have a practice during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva or Rosh Hashanah in particular, not to eat nuts, right? Why do we not eat nuts during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva? Because somehow it says, Elliot's already asked challenging all of your math. We don't have to do that now, it's not Tishrei, right? Egos and chet is the same numerical value, okay? So let's assume that you could be off by one and we're not really counting so closely. Let's assume that that's the case. Very simple question. What's an egos? Have you had this fight at your Rosh Hashanah table before? That there's some lady at the table, her name is Rivka, let's say theoretically, and Rivka says, you're not allowed to have any nuts at the table. No pistachios, no walnuts, no almonds, no cashews, no anything, sunflower seeds, they're kind of a nut. You can't have anything. And the rest of the family says, it's not fair. We like to have pecan pie. We're not allowed to have pecan pie because you decided that pecans are a gozim. Not true. Right? I've had this discussion many times as well. So it all depends what negos is. So the mitzvah is ner ishu beso. So let's all agree. It's not so crazy to ask a very basic halachic question about this tremendous miracle. What exactly is a ner and what is not a ner? Poskim asked the very same question. Can you light an electric menorah? There's different standards for Nerot Shabbat and the ore that we need for Havdalah. We use different kinds of candles, different kinds of wicks because they have different rules. So maybe it's easier to use electric lights for Shabbos candles than it is for Havdalah. Maybe you need a real flame. How do you create an avuka? You have to have multiple wicks. You have to have real fire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, Maharal's asking the very same question here. So the Gemara only gives us one item with which we can fulfill this mitzvah, and it goes out of its way to tell you that you can be yotzei the mitzvah with a ner, and you cannot be yotzei the mitzvah with a medura. Why can't I light 8 torches? Tell that to the Chabad guys with those gigantic menorahs, right? So why? You can't be yotzei the mitzvah that way? Well, it's not. It's a medura. It's a gigantic torch. It's not a candle. So how do you translate ner? So the Maharal says, I'll tell you how you translate ner. The way you translate ner is wicks in oil. If it's not wicks in oil, it's not a ner. Sounds like a very reasonable, if not overly sensitive halachic position. Okay? But then he shifts and he says, the Medrash talks about that the Sefer is called ner mitzvah v'torah or. So he's going to, as the pasuk says, he's going to distinguish between ner and or and all these different things. And then he goes on to explain why this is so. And this is very Maharal-like. That even though the halacha that he's trying to teach you is just a halachic question, but it's also a metaphysical, spiritual question. What is the symbolism of a candle versus the symbolism of oil? What does it mean that we think that the light on the candle is symbolic of the soul, but the fuel that energizes, that helps the wick produce that light is a representative of the body? So how intrinsic, how much synthesis is there between the guf and the neshama? So he says, my halachic position actually makes perfect sense. Lighting Hanukkah candles, lighting a yahrzeit candle for someone who passed away, we should be thinking about the relationship between the candle and the light that it produces. And we should care about that relationship. So it's true that 90% of the people in Prague light candles. But anybody who's medakdek b'mitzvos, if you care what the word ner means, and if you appreciate the symbolism of what candles are supposed to represent, you won't use candles, you'll use oil, you'll do it the right way. This is not a halachic position that is accepted by almost anyone else, but it gives you a little bit of a window into the way the Maharal thinks about mitzvos. First, he starts out by saying, you should really care about the details of your mitzvah. Then he says the second thing is that I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just going to state my opinion, take it or leave it. The third thing he says is that ner specifically does not mean candles. And the fourth is that he thinks symbolically candles are antithetical to what it means to be a Jew, at least in this context. And then he rests his case and he moves on to something else that you're not going to do either, which is really, to me, like incredible, absolutely incredible. And he goes on to do the other ones. Okay, he talks about Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. He talks about the timing of the way that we light. He talks about the order of lighting Shabbos candles and Hanukkah candles, and then talking about the way that they light Hanukkah candles relative to Havdalah on Motzei Shabbos. He's interested in all these little details, and he wants to do the minhag his way. And then he transitions to talking about philosophy of Hanukkah, and this is what I wanted to give as much time to as we possibly could. I did something that was probably a mistake here for those of you whose vision is not so great. The next essay is like 14 pages long. So I just cut and paste without the footnotes so I could get it all onto one piece of paper. So it's very small. It's big enough for me to read, but probably not big enough for you. So you'll just have to trust me that everything I say is 100% accurate, which I wouldn't do either. The Maharal has an essay here on the next page. This is page 4. Again, it's going to be hard to follow all the Hebrew, but I'll try and remind you when I get to these underlined sections so you could see them. We're starting on the top right. This is the top section from page Kuf Yud Gimel. Okay, the Maharal has an essay here that is an analysis of a Gemara in Shabbos that he also analyzes in his commentary to the Gemara on Masechet Shabbat. And it's relevant to Hanukkah and it's relevant to the Maharal in the most interesting way. Okay, top right corner is page Kuf Yud Gimel. In the second column, it says V'haschar al zos ha-mitzvah. He wants to talk about the reward that one gets for doing mitzvos. And the reason he wants to talk about it is because the Gemara in Shabbos, in this section about Hanukkah, quotes the following thing, okay? The Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna, Haragil b'ner, you see it in the second column? Haragil b'ner. What does that mean? Let's assume that means someone who is careful or diligent to make sure that they always light candles properly. Havyan le banim talmidei chachamim. What's the reward for doing the mitzvah of candles correctly? You'll have children or sons who are Talmidei Chachamim. Then the Gemara says, Hazar b'mezuzah, if you're diligent in performance of the mitzvah of mezuzah, Zocha ledira na'eh, you'll be lucky enough to live in a beautiful home. Hazar b'tzitzis, if you're careful about the mitzvah of tzitzis, Zocha l'talis na'eh. So then Hashem will reward you with beautiful clothing. Hazar b'kiddush hayom, if someone is careful to always make kiddush, what does that mean? I don't know. It means you use enough grape juice, or you're makbid to use wine, or use a fancy cup, or you do it on time, whatever that means. Zocha umimale garbe yayin. You'll be lucky enough to drink good wines. You know, you'll have a wine cellar. You'll have trips wherever people go out west to try all the great wines. You'll be rewarded. Adkan. Okay, so let's just review for a second, because all of this is going to be important. The Gemara says that if a person is careful in the way they light candles, they'll be zocha to having children that are Talmidei Chacham. If you're careful with mezuzah, you'll be lucky enough to have a beautiful home. If you're careful with tzitzis, you'll be lucky enough to have good clothing. And if you're careful with kiddush, you'll be lucky enough to have great wine. So, any questions before we go forward? Say again. Okay, so obviously we have to talk about Ner and Baran Talmidei Chachamim, and the Gemara does not say what kind of candle we're talking about or what kind of Ner is being used, which mitzvah is being performed. Any other questions? Well, okay, what does careful mean? It probably means to do it the way the Maharal does it, right? No, right? Oh, very good. So the first reward is if you're makbid to do with the candles, you'll have children that are Talmidei Chachamim. Amazing. If you do the mezuzah, you'll have real estate benefits. Tzitzis, you'll have fancy clothes. You're makbid on kiddush, you'll have beautiful wine. So it feels a little disjointed to begin with, which isn't so surprising in a Gemara that's about Hanukkah. That's kind of slanted in the candle direction, but that's okay. Umasha Amar Haragil Bener. In Pirusho Bener Shel Shabbos Bilvad, Im Kain Havilid Mimar Hazar Bener Shel Shabbos. Right? It doesn't say you're careful with wine. It says you're careful with kiddush. So the Gemara should have said if you're careful with Shabbos candles. Obviously, it's not just talking about Shabbos candles. It's also referring to Hanukkah candles. Im Kain Havilid Mimar Hazar Bener. The ode Demaisi Hadar Huna Eitzel Ner Chanukah. Right? So it's in the right place to be for. We're thinking about Ner Chanukah. This applies to any mitzvah that involves a candle. The kasha, Tahavi le'lomar haragil b'ner yeh tamid chacham ba'atzmo. It's a little bit better than David's ha'ara. If I wear tzitzis, I get a fancy suit. If I'm careful with mezuzah, I live in a beautiful house. If I'm careful with neiros, I'll have children. They'll become Talmidei Chachamim. And what? I'm going to sit here being Amaretz the rest of my life. That's not fair. V'lama amar ki yiyu banim Talmidei Chachamim. V'od kasha d'lefi asvara hayla lios makdim v'lomar hazar b'tzitzis. Now the Maharal says, next question. Well, he doesn't understand the order. So one is to do with clothing. One has to do with residence. One has to do with candles. One has to do with what you drink. So he says, it should have been the other way. Hazar b'tzitzis shehu mitzvah begufo. It should have started with tzitzis because that's the mitzvah that physically touches your body. V'achar kach mitzvah shel beso, and then he should have moved into the things in the house. V'od masha amar zocha ledira na'eh v'chein zocha letalis na'eh im kain hayla lomar gamkin hazar b'sukkah zocha lesukkah na'eh v'chein har b'dvarim. He says, well, the piece of this that bothers the Maharal maybe the most, the last question, is it seems so overly simple, doesn't it? If you're makbid on kiddush, Hashem will give you great wine. And if you fulfill the mitzvah of mezuzah on your house, so then you'll have a great house. Okay, so I'm very makbid on sukkah, so then Hashem will give me a beautiful backyard to build a sukkah in. And if I'm really careful with shofar, so then I'm going to have the best shofar around. And if I'm really careful with matzah, I'm going to get a great deal on matzah next year. Like it's so obvious. So what does it mean? Upirush zeh. This is Kuf Yudal, going on to that second section. First column onto the second column. Ki ha'adam hu muchan la'olam hazeh. Man is designed for, prepared for living in this world. Second column of that page. Ve'olam hazeh nikra ner. This came like out of left field. Olam hazeh is called a candle. V'zeh mipnei ki haner hu dolek lizman ma v'yesh lo hefsek. So now, in the footnotes, Rabbi Hartman points out that in the Gemara in Shabbos, the Maharal explains what is going to become obvious to us in just a minute, which is the Maharal believes that every soul goes through 4 stages in its journey in the universe, which is really interesting. Stage number 1, life. Stage number 2, death. Stage number 3, Tchias HaMesim. Stage number 4, Olam Haba. I guess Yemos HaMashiach is something like Tchias HaMesim. And it's always, these things are always kind of blurry. Olam Hazeh, death, Tchias HaMesim, Olam Haba. These are the 4 stages that we go through. The Maharal says here that life on this world, in this planet, this physical existence, is the light of the candle. This will change the way you celebrate Hanukkah, and more importantly, this will change the way that you light yahrzeit candles for the rest of your life. The Maharal says the reason that we use a candle is because it's dolek lizman ma v'yesh lo hefsek, which means how long can the candle stay bright? As long as it still has fuel. But what is the candle doing in order to stay bright? It's consuming all the fuel that's beneath it. By its very nature, every light that consumes its fuel is temporary. It's eventually going to burn out. This is a physical life. God gives you a body, and the soul is with that body. The soul is the ner. Remember from the previous essay on the halacha? So the soul is able to produce in this world with the assistance of the body. How long does the body last? Me'eva esrim, and then it burns out. That's just the nature of being a human being. So the ner is symbolic of our world. Skip to the next page, Kuf Tezvav. It's again that paragraph there, the next paragraph below it, underlined section. The Amar ki haragel b'ner muchan sheyelo olam hazeh. Ner doesn't mean if you're careful with candles, you'll have children that are Talmidei Chachamim. That's not what it means. Ner means someone who is muchan la'olam hazeh, shehu ner. Mipnei ki ha'adam ba'olam hazeh hu ba'al misa. Our very existence is temporary. We all eventually die. V'lo nikra sheyesh lo olam hazeh hashleimas, rak hasher yesh lo banim shenisharim acharav. The only continuity that we have is future generations. A person who masters life in this world, the greatest reward you could give them, because their existence here is temporary, is that there will be somebody to follow in their footsteps. There's nothing you could do. You could be the greatest tzaddik in the world. You could live the most meaningful Jewish life. May have asked him, it's over. The only way to have that continuity is to pass it on to someone else. So the ner is a fleeting light that burns its source of fuel. And the only way to keep it going is to pass it to another candle that has a new source of fuel. That's the ner. Then he goes on, next paragraph there, Kuf Tez Zayin. This one's hard to read. V'yomer hazahir b'mezuzah, v'zeki ha'adam achar moso, hu muchan sheyelo menucha. After we die, we get rest. Kimo sheyesh lo bayis, shehu mako menuchasa. It doesn't mean that if a person is lucky enough to perform the mitzvah of mezuzah, Hashem will bless them with a good home. The bias refers to resting, their ultimate resting place. That's what the Medrash says. V'chein amru b'medrash ki holecha adam el beis olamo. When we go to the cemetery, we refer to it as the Beis Olam. Why do we call it the Beis Olam? Because people work out in the day in the fields, and when they're done, they come home and they rest. The ultimate resting place is the Beis Olam. What does mezuzah mean in the Gemara? A person who's makbid to take the mitzvah of mezuzah seriously, they understand the difference between hard work out in the field, a good day's work, and rest when it's over. Person understands what life is about. They understand what death is about. If a person understands, internalizes the symbolism of mezuzah, not only will they live a meaningful life, but even after they're gone, they will have a meaningful afterlife. They'll have a meaningful place of rest. What does the Mishnah say in Avos? I underlined it towards the bottom of that page. Olam hazeh is doma to Prusdor. Everyone remember? It's like the entryway, right? Into what? Into a bigger room. What happens there? That's where everybody has their menucha. So the mezuzah is symbolic of the doorways. Like we go from the Prusdor into the Traklin, we go from one room into the other, we earn our rest in that place. Top of the next column. The Amar Od, Hazayir Bitzitis, Zochel Latalis Noem. What does that mean? If you're careful on the mitzvah of Sittis, Hashem will bless you with good clothing. No, that's not what it means. V'zen nemar ki yesh od olam achar hatichiyah. Right? We have resurrection. And the Gemara says, Hazar b'tzitz zochel talis naki l'zman hatchiyah yamdu bilvush sehen. Amazing. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Tzadi Amud Beis, says Cleopatra the queen, Cleopatra Malchusa, asked Rabbi Meir the question, Yadana dechaye shichri. We believe, you believe, that after people die, they are resurrected. The pasuk says, "V'yatitzu me'er ke'esev haaretz," right? We'll sprout back from the earth, like the way that we were born. Ela kishehein omdin arumim o bilvushein omdin. Cleopatra, according to the Gemara in Sanhedrin, asked Rabbi Meir, when Tchias HaMesim happens, when we come out of the grave, so are we naked or are we clothed? Now, did she mean that seriously, or was she mocking our belief in Tchias HaMesim? I don't know, right? I remember Rabbi Temler's Zatzal being asked about organ donation. People used to chepper him, apparently, when he was very pro-organ donation during his lifetime. People would say, you give all your organs away, and then Tchias HaMesim happens, and then you don't have any organs left. And Rabbi Temler used to say, I don't know exactly how he phrased it. He says, what do you think is with the bones, the muscles, and the skin? How do you think that's doing 500 years later, right? So Cleopatra is asking this question. What happens at Tchias HaMesim? And what's the question that she asks Rabbi Meir? Of all the things you're curious about, are you going to be naked or are you going to be dressed? It'd be kind of embarrassing after all those years in the ground to wake up and realize you're naked. It's not so good, right? So Rabbi Meir says a kal v'chomer, back to Cleopatra. When you plant grains of wheat, you plant them naked. They're just little seeds. And when they pop up from the ground, they have layers and layers and layers of clothing on top of them. Tzadikim, shenikbarim bilvuseim, tzadikim who are buried in the shrouds of Misa, alachas kama v'kama, how much more so at the time of Tchias HaMesim will they be dressed? Now the Maharal goes on to explain here in a little bit of a tangent, but it's so fascinating and beautiful that the world that will exist in the times of Tchias HaMesim will be a world that is kulo kavod. What does that remind you of? Anybody? Trivia? Kulo kavod. Was it? Shabbos. Why does it remind you of Shabbos? Yom Shekulo, Shabbos Uvnucha, right? It's going to be a day of kavod. That's what we say in our Zmiros. It's going to be a day of kavod because it's reminiscent of that world to come. The idea, this is the part that's so fascinating. The way that the Maharal understands the sugya with Rabbi Meir and Cleopatra, what Rabbi Meir is saying from this kal v'chomer is that the world that we experience after resurrection is a world in which there is no shame. He doesn't make this point. It popped into my head, so I'm saying it. Adam and Chava, the very beginning of our world, in a world of hate, the first thing they experience after sin is shame. You're not going to reappear in the world and be embarrassed of your nakedness. That would be like starting from scratch. That's what Rabbi Meir says to Cleopatra, which is amazing. Hazayir b'tzitzis, if someone lives a life in which they are careful about mitzvot that pertain to their kavod, like wearing the right things, making sure that your clothing reflect who you are on the inside, you project your values outside, and you're wearing your tzitzis, you'll be zocheh to a resurrection that is kulo kavod menucha l'chayi olam. That's stage 3. And then in Kuf Chaf Aleph, the Maharal continues, the bottom of the first column there in Kuf Chaf Aleph, the Amar Hazahir b'Kiddush Hayom, Zoche umimale gar b'yayin. Davar zeh nemer al olam haba. She'aziyeh lehem hayayin hamishumar l'tzadikim la'asid lavo. We have this tradition, those of us who like a good glass of wine, that ultimately in olam haba, at the very end of time, will be zoche to a beautiful wine. The pasuk says in Yeshaya, "Ayim lo rasa lo kimsu lasecha." We haven't seen anything like HaKadosh Baruch Hu yet in our existence. And the Gemara says in Brachos and Daf Lamed Daled, Zehu Yayin HaMishumar, right? Wine gets better with time. So when time has fully developed, the wine will finally be ready to drink. That's the ultimate future, the last chapter in our existence. Al Kach Amar, Mishu Mekadesh Hayom, Vu Bivadai Al Hayayin. We make Kiddush, we use Yayin. What is Kiddush Hayom? It's the significance of time. Right? You do Kiddush Hayom to start Shabbos and Havdalah to recognize that Shabbos has come to an end. Kiddush Hayom hu al hayayin hu mekadesh Shabbos asher hu me'ein olam haba. So the last stage is olam haba. Shabbos is me'ein olam haba. Ulakachu zoche u'mamala gar b'yayin v'yelo olam haba. And then in the next page on Kuf Chaf Beis, second column in the underlined, well, actually, hold right there. So just to review, the Maharal has done something, I know it's confusing and in small print, but it's actually quite fantastic, right? The Gemara says, if you do this mitzvah, you'll get this reward. If you do this mitzvah, you'll get that reward. The Maharal, as we know from previous sugyas, right? He absolutely believes everything the Gemara says, but that doesn't necessarily mean he reads the Gemara the same way as you. So the Gemara is not talking about schar mitzvah in the traditional sense, that if you do mitzvah X, Hashem rewards you with reward Y. You do A, you get B. That's not how it works. But the Gemara is talking about a way of understanding our own destiny as people. We go from life, we go to death, we go to resurrection, eventually we make our way to Olam Haba. These are the 4 stages of our journey. And each step of the way, if we invest now in our future, Hashem will reward us in each of those steps. Step number 1 is if you live a meaningful life in this world, you'll be zocha to have people who follow in your footsteps to continue receiving that reward from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In future generations, you'll have banim that are Talmidei Chachamim. And then in the second step, the Maharal says that if you're makbid on the mitzvah of mezuzah, Hashem will bless you with a resting place that is a resting place that you deserve. Third, if you're makbid on the mitzvah of tzitzis, when Tchias HaMesim comes, you can be reassured that you will be part of resurrection. You will be awoken from that slumber, dressed to the nines for the full kavod of what Tchias HaMesim is. And ultimately, if a person is makbid on the mitzvah of Kiddush, they appreciate the time they have on this planet, so it will lead them to appreciation of that Yayin HaMishumar La'olam Haba. Okay, so that is really a fascinating read on its own. But it gets just a little bit better, because it turns out that the Maharal himself likes to talk about wine a lot. Right? If you were to say, like, these are the steps that you will traverse over the course of your life, and the grand prize at the end of the tunnel is, what would it be? A Rolls Royce for everybody, right? It depends what you're into. Now, the Gemara does say there's Yayin HaMishumar L'Olam Haba. He's not making it up, but it's very significant. Why does the Maharal think, or why does the Maharal celebrate the fact that wine is really important? Anybody who knows, you could go home. This is the end of the semester. It's really unbelievable. It's really unbelievable. What do you think was the most contentious halachic issue in the time of the Maharal? If I didn't give it away already, it's pretty obvious. Non-Jewish wine. The hot issue in the 16th century was Stam Yena, this long-standing debate about whether or not the rules of non-Jewish wine should still apply in modern times, which by their standards, they were modern. What are there? Two zeros? That's not true. There's yayin nesach. Yayin nesach is a biblical prohibition, which means wine that is poured not on the mizbeach, wine that is poured as libations for other gods is absolutely us. You can't drink it, can't benefit from it, can't sell it, can't anything, right? Because that's avodah zarah wine. That makes a lot of sense. What's stam yenam? Goyim are very religious, right? So you can never have wine that was owned by a guy. You shouldn't even have wine that was touched by a guy, because if he owned it and you ask him, by the way, before I buy this wine from you, have you ever used it for religious purposes? So he's going to say no, but you can't believe him, right? What happens if he touches a bottle of wine right in front of you, right? It's not mevushal. So he touched it. So who cares? Well, maybe he says a little tefillah while he does it. And then you don't know, you're not an expert in how they worship nowadays. So the whole thing has to be prohibited rabbinically. Midaraisa, there's yayin nesach. Midrabanan, there's stam yenam and maga yayin, etc. All these restrictions. Second possibility is, of course, you drink together, you marry each other. So Chachamim put these things into play. You can use wine for avodah zarah on a biblical level, and anything that could be related to wine that is used for avodah zarah, belonging to goyim, kalit, intermarriage, etc., is all forbidden midrabanan. Okay. What about Christians? What about Muslims? What about a Jew who's in business and the non-Jew says, I'll pay you back for the investment, but I don't want to give you cash. I'd rather give you a barrel of wine. So you're not allowed to sell stam yenam. You're not allowed to drink it. You can't sell it to other people. You can't benefit from it. So what do you do with it? This became a major issue in the 16th century, and it was a real problem. And on top of it, they're not pagan. The Christians of their day aren't really worshiping with wine in the way that people used to worship with wine. Maybe they do a little bit on Sundays. It's not the same thing. Regular wine is regular wine, isn't it? So do these rules still apply? Okay, if we know they used it for worship, that's one thing. But what if we don't know that they worshiped with it? What if it's regular wine in the grocery store that's never been used and never been touched? Why can't I buy it and drink it like everybody else? The ingredients are exactly the same. Some ancient rabbinic prohibition against using wine of pagans. I live in France in the 1500s. Why should that rule apply to me? Right? Sounds familiar. I can't take Tylenol on Shabbos because I'm going to grind it, and I don't grind my own medications. I don't have a mortar and pestle in my house. I'm not a, what's the word for someone who's fancier than a pharmacist back in the day? Yeah, saying that's not me. I don't know how to do any of those things. So should it still apply to me? This was the hot topic for a lot of reasons. So first I want to read you the Maharal, and then I'll read you something else. The Maharal stops here. He gives you this beautiful interpretation of our Gemara. But the Gemara ends by saying, in Olam Haba, you'll get Yayin HaMeshumar. What does Yayin HaMeshumar mean? Really precious, good, lasting wine. So the Maharal says, by the way, once we're talking about Yayin, allow me. Okay, Kuf Chav Beis, first column. Why do you think the Chachamim were so machmir about wine? V'asu oso b'shtia. Hinei ki kol yisrael yesh lam chilak la'olam haba. You see what he's going to do right here? If you follow the Maharal, you get it right away. He just told you that when you finally make it to the fourth and ultimate stage of your destiny, God will pour you a glass of wine, right? And then the Gemara in Avodah Zarah told us that everybody has a chilak in olam haba. And I was just told that olam haba is yayin hameshumar. V'al tomar ki davar zeh yayin mamish. I don't think we're actually going to get up there and God is going to pull out a bottle of wine. But he's told us this 1,000 times. Raku hamala hapnimis asher lo nigla l'shum bria. We don't know exactly what it means, but God is going to open a bottle that you've never had before. Whatever that means, metaphorically. Ki im Hashem yisbarach v'nikra yayin ki hayayin ba'atzmahu mishumar tocha anav. Which is very interesting. Where do you get the wine from? You have to squeeze it out from the inside of the grapes. V'nistarbo, it's hidden away. Umepnei kach tzarach sheyiyah l'kol hapachot yayin shel Yisrael shehu ba'olam hazeh mishumar min hagoyim. Jewish wine needs to be separate from the God. V'az yisku l'yayin hamishumar legamri. And then you'll benefit from the ultimate yayin l'olam haba. V'lo b'chinam zachu chazal omer yayin hamishumar v'lo amru yayin hatzafun. It doesn't mean wine that was hidden. It was wine that was guarded. It was wine that was maturing in the barrel. Rak lahodia sheyeh mishumar min ha'umos. The whole halacha of yayin nesach, the whole rabbinic instruction of stam yenam wasn't just a thing. Chazal knew what they were doing. They were trying to carve out Jewish privacy, right? They were trying to carve out Jewish exceptionalism in their own way. And they did it through yayin. It's not just practical, but it's also conceptual and metaphysical. That when Chazal talk about getting that yayin hamashumar at the end of days, it's because we were able to hold on to our unique identity in our times. And the way that they did it was through yayin. The whole thing makes perfect sense if you think about yayin through the metaphor of the Maharal. And then look what he does, transitioning to the last paragraphs here on the page. Lo kimo sheyesh anashim she'ein nizharim b'zeh. You know those people out there that drink stam yenam? Do I have time for a story? Not really, but I'm telling it anyway. The first year, Ariella and I've told this story a few times, lived on the Upper West Side. We decided we weren't able to go home for Thanksgiving. So we decided to host a Thanksgiving dinner in our apartment for people, for singles on the West Side who couldn't go home either for the weekend. So we had a tiny Thanksgiving dinner, like 10 people in our small apartment. And a few people brought different things. So I'm sitting at the table with this person who I grew up with in Baltimore. He's a few years older than me. I ended up marrying him and his wife a few years later. He's a lovely guy. We're sitting at the table drinking this bottle of wine. Nobody else is drinking wine, just the two of us who thought we were mature enough at 26 years old to drink this bottle of wine. And he says to me, it's so strange. You know, I've been living on the West Side now for 4 years. I go around Shabbos meals. All the singles do on the West Side is drink wine with each other all Shabbos afternoon. I've had every good bottle of kosher wine that there is available on the Upper West Side. I've never had this one. I can't believe it. So we're sitting there drinking wine. And he's like reading the label. He says to me, it's so weird. I've never bought this bottle before. Then he's like, he goes, can I talk to you in the kitchen? You know? And I served treif wine in my first Thanksgiving dinner because one of the punchline to the story really is that I was obviously embarrassed. Nobody else noticed. We just poured it out and like, whatever, what can you do? Like mistakes happen, right? Mistakes happen. That's what the Orach Chaim says. The Orach Chaim says in the pasuk says v'his kadishtem v'yisem kedoshim. So what does that mean? V'his kadishtem v'yisem kedoshim. If you make yourself holy, then Hashem will make you holy. What is that? Like, you're either holy or you're not. So the Chaim says there's only so much you can do to make yourself. You can try and be as holy as you want, but all the holiness really comes from up there. V'hit kadishtem means you will attempt to make yourself holy, and if you're lucky, v'yisem kedoshim, Hashem will actually do the work. So sometimes you try and you serve treif wine anyway. What could you do? So weeks later, I'm in Duane Reade picking up something, and right next to the register, there's a rack of Chateau Diana, which I just drank on Thanksgiving. And I realized that the person had never been invited to a Thanksgiving. There was a very young person, and she stopped at the register at Duane Reade, and she figured, like, I'll just get them a bottle of wine. Probably the first bottle of wine she ever bought in her life. She probably doesn't even know that it needs to be kosher. She just drinks whatever's on the table. It's only grapes anyway, right? And she grabbed a bottle, and I was offended because it's such a cheap guess. It's like $6.99 a bottle, which I thought was very rude. Either way, exactly. I know the person well. She is not on Zoom. Either way, she may be. I mean, the recording will be up for. We never told her. So if she doesn't watch all 7 episodes of Maharal in the future, 9 hours in, she will realize that 10 years ago, I don't think it's going to be a problem. I don't think it's going to be a problem. Okay, so this is what the Maharal says. He says, you know, this yayin business is serious. Chazal knew what they were doing. It's not a coincidence that they could have ossered coffee, right? They could have ossered candy. They could have made these isurim on taking showers. They didn't do that. They made an isur about wine. And it's not just because people drink wine in bars. They also eat potato chips. Like they eat hot pretzels on the street. They didn't osser that, right? Wine they did because there's something metaphysical, something spiritual, something mystical happening here with yayin l'olam haba. Lo kimo sheyesh anashim she'enam nizharim b'zeh. There are these people. This is that last page, Kuf Chaf Gimel. People who aren't careful about stam yenam. Ve'im mashgichim b'divrei chachamim asher gazru v'chmiru al zeh me'od me'od. Anybody who learns Shas knows Gemara talks about treif wine all the time. You can't just wave it away. It doesn't apply anymore. Half of Shas is about treif wine. Kemoshu Yadua. V'yira, kevan she'in mashgichim b'divrei chachamim. What kind of person doesn't take this Isser seriously? They don't care what the Chachamim say. Yesh aleihem mishpat v'din karaim. Heim habilti ma'aminin. It's like being a heretic. If you're not going to take what the Chachamim say about wine seriously, you can just get out of here. V'yefshar lefarish onsham. He said, I can't even tell you how bad of a punishment they're going to get. V'osim elu anashim ki'ilu chas v'shalom Yisrael shehem am echad mechulak b'dasam v'torasam. And now there's machlokas. There's Jews who are makbid about wine, and Jews who aren't makbid about wine. Like that's a normal option. These aren't normal options. The whole point, by the way, is that yain is supposed to keep Jews apart from everybody else. And now the Jews can't decide which wine they're allowed to drink and which one they're not. So there's divisions within the Jewish community, which is the antithesis of this entire takana. The davar zeh shavchinu v'tifartenu mashi Yisrael him echad b'torasam. Mika amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. Imagine what the Maharal would say: Jews fighting over something that leads more machlokas between Jews than there is between Jews and Goyim. For him, metaphysically, that's such a tragedy. V'al yedei elu anashim hamordim v'haposhim v'hachodim. Shkatzim, these terrible Jews drinking their treif wine. Ki ilu chas v'shalom ein etzleinu davar shu shabchinu v'tifartenu lakach b'nei Yisrael suru me'al ha'anashim ha'ela. What's the quote? Who remembers? Suru na me'al anashim ha'rishaim ha'ela v'al tigu b'chol asher lahem. Korach. Thank you for whoever that was. Debbie Sondheim on the Zoom. Extra credit, right? You have to remember, this is what you're doing, because the Maharal is talking about machlokas, right? Something that could tear the Jewish people apart. Half the Jews keep the kashrus of yain, half the Jews don't keep the kashrus of yain. It's a disaster. There's no other option. You got to run the other direction because the earth's going to swallow them up. So, who disagrees with the Maharal? What was happening in the 1500s when the Maharal was writing about this? It does all the time. Right? So Rabbi Hartman points out, why is the Maharal doing this in Hilchos Hanukkah? Or you're here for a Hanukkah shir. We're supposed to talk about latkes and oil. We're supposed to talk about candles. Why is he ranting and raving about treif wine? So technically the Gemara starts with ner and it ends with yayin. So, okay, fine. But remember, the whole thing is about Jews maintaining Jewish identity, right? Separatism is essential to maintaining Jewish identity, whether you like it or not. The story of the Greeks is not the story of Purim. It's not the story of someone assimilation. Who thought that we could wipe someone else out or commit genocide. It's the belief in assimilation. Everybody can be welcome. You don't have to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. We could all just get along. But for the Maharal, that's worse than genocide. The fact that this ends with an essay about how we keep ourselves separate very much tells you about what he thought Hanukkah was about as well. On the last page, you have a selection. This is from Byron Sherwin's biography of the Maharal, which was what inspired me to give this series from the beginning. So it's only appropriate that we give Professor Sherwin the credit that he deserves for his wonderful book on the life of the Maharal. And he points out that the person who is most associated with disagreeing with the Maharal on the issue of wine is our good old friend, Rav Moshe Isserles, the Rama. Now, this is not exactly true. I'll explain in a minute, but it's important nonetheless. The very first halacha in the third section of Yoreh Deah in Shulchan Aruch is the halacha of Yayin Nesach. And what does the Rama say in his first comment in the first siman of Yoreh Deah's halachos of Yayin Nesach? Some people say nowadays it's not so bad. Because it's not the same. It's not the same. And that's what everybody was saying. That was word on the street at the time. Now, I looked it up because I saw the footnote. I had to look it up. The Rama also has tshuvos. And in his response, I think it is Simin Kuf Chaf Dalid. I looked it up earlier this morning. The Rama is sent to Shaila. And the question is, do we still have to observe Stam Yenam nowadays? And the Rama writes back, the tshuva is fantastic. Maybe on Purim, we'll do the tshuva inside or in advance of Purim, because it's a great Purim topic also. The Rama starts out by saying, what do you want me to say? And this is the window into the history. What do you mean? You write to the greatest halachic authority of the 16th century, and you ask him, can you drink non-Jewish wine? And he writes back, no, you may not. It's not complicated. That's what I would have written back, right? He writes back, what am I supposed to say? If I say you're allowed to drink it, so then everybody's going to go out and drink treif wine. It's cheaper. He doesn't say that. And if I say it's treif because it's actually usher to drink it, so then I'm condemning all of Moravia. Because if you go to Moravia today, 1520, 1540, 1560, 1580, they drink treif wine. They do business with treif wine. They get their loans paid back with barrels of wine, which they then go and sell to their friends and use at the Pesach Seder. So the Rama says, what am I supposed to do? I could paskin it's usher, and everybody's going to be drinking treif. Or I could paskin that it's mutter, and more people are going to drink treif. So he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm not a fan of it. I don't think you should drink it, but it's not as bad as it used to be, and I'll explain why. And then he spends 4 paragraphs explaining why it's not as bad as it used to be. They're not really pagans, and like Stami is only Drabanan, and it's only Drabanan because you don't really know, and there's a difference between touching wine and touching wine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he ends off by saying, you're really, really, really not supposed to drink it, although I'm not saying it's not so bad. And you're not like, what happened here? And the scholars point out that that at certain points in Jewish history, this tshuva of the Rama was edited because it's unfathomable to people that the Rama wrote a tshuva where he was unequivocal, where he was equivocating about the kashrus of treif wine. It's crazy, but it was a different moment in Jewish history. You take for granted that the only person in this room to have ever had a glass of Chateau Diana is me, but usually. You can assume that the wine is kosher. They've got 16 hashkachas on them. They're kosher Pesach all year round. That's the way yayin is. You can barely find a bottle of wine that's not mevushal nowadays, unless some of you are fancier than me, right? That's not the way it was. It was a major issue among frum Jews in Prague, in Krakow, and everywhere else. And the Maharal did not take the Rama's position on this. The Rama was a little iffy, and I don't know. Not the Maharal. He didn't care if he was different. He didn't care if he was the only one in class who said you can't use candles for your menorah. No way are they, when he was in Moravia, remember, back and forth between Prague and these other places, there's no way they're drinking treif wine in my shul. Look at the paragraph, page 96. This was in a record of the statutes of the Jewish community of Moravia, edited into its final form in 1650. The following appears, 1650, 41 years after the Maharal passes away. In a statute of early scholars and a decree of the great Goner master, Rabbi of Prague, may the memory of the righteous be a blessing, right? Zechorno Vracha, that the matter of use of Gentile wine, both sacramental and non-sacramental by Jews, remains unchanged. What do you mean? You still have to keep kosher? Yeah, nobody, they're all drinking treif wine. Not here, they said. The strength of this statute is now as it was earlier. Whoever drinks such wine puts himself under a ban of excommunication. In Moravia, if you get caught drinking a bottle of Stam Yenam, they put you in Cherem. I think in the first year, 2 months ago, we talked about a Cherem of the Maharal. So we're going to wrap it up 7 shiurim later with another Cherem. He becomes ineligible to participate in any religious occasion. He may not come before the Holy Ark in the synagogue to lead the congregation in prayers or recite blessings over the Torah. Can't daven for the Amud. You can't have an aliyah for the course of the year, meaning if you get caught once, they give you a 12-month cherem. We'll revisit it next year. Maybe next year you can get an aliyah on your yard site, especially not on the new year or the Day of Atonement. You think you're going to get an aliyah in my shul if you drink stam yenam? You're in cherem. The reason they did this was because there were not only Jews who were drinking it, but there were Rabbanim who said it was okay. And the Maharal went to town every chance he got. Every chance he got. Yayin came up, he said, by the way, there's this thing in Shulchan Aruch called Stam Yena. Can't drink it. Look at what Sherwin says, the last paragraph on 97. For Judah Low, Jewish law represented the crystallization of theological assumptions. We saw that tonight, right? I mean, it's not just a question of are candles Neros or not Neros. There's also something mystical, theological about it. The commandments were divine and true in themselves. They represented an early manifestation of ultimate reality. The natural couldn't abrogate the supernatural. The commandments in general and the wine prohibition in particular had to remain in effect. finding a natural, logical, economic, or historical reason for observance, and then dispensing with the given religious practice because of the reason is presently obsolete, is an exercise in futility. In other words, the Chachamim put this into motion. They don't want you drinking non-Jewish wine. Just because the practices of those religions change doesn't mean that the halacha changes. Any rationale found cannot be the reason, i.e. God's reason. Rabbi Lo's opposition to those who would attempt to rationalize their opposition to the letter of the law is grounded in his theology of the nature of the Torah, the nature of the commandments, and his belief in the futility, which he often identified with exponents of Jewish philosophical tradition. One of the things that we often struggle with in Jewish law, and with this I will close, sometimes the rabbi tells you you're not allowed to do it. And you say, Rabbi, but why? And the rabbi's response to that is not so great. Sometimes the rabbi feels like this should not be allowed, this cannot be allowed, and people just ask, what does it say on paper? Mutter, usser, kosher, treif. That's the end of the discussion. Those of us who do not operate with the theology of the Maharal struggle to take halacha to that next level. You can't just play politics, and you can't just win every argument with the slippery slope argument, right? If we're makel about sherry casks, then who knows what's going to happen next? That's not convincing to anybody. You have to have a real conversation. Either there's sherry in it or there isn't sherry in it, right? I'm not looking at anybody in particular. I'm just saying. What the Maharal introduces us to, which is difficult for us because we are not blessed with the same metaphysical glasses through which he saw the entire universe, is that for him, everything halachic was also somehow spiritual and metaphysical. And he almost always sees those two things as perfectly conjoined with one another. It's not just a, does nair mean oil or does nair mean candles? But what's the relationship between the wick and the fuel? And then the halacha makes perfect sense, right? It's not just a question of, will drinking wine lead to intermarriage, but drinking coffee won't lead to intermarriage? All the sugyas, all the symbolism, the very physical essence of the grape, the fact that wine comes from the inside of the grape and not the outside of the grape, the fact that it takes time to mature, that it has a special bracha, all these things lead to the fact that the yayin is symbolic of Jewish separatism. And the idea that you would make a technical, legal argument in which you would say, well, this technicality doesn't apply anymore, therefore we can all drink treif wine, it doesn't make sense because his whole theology tells him culturally and spiritually and socially, this can't be. It's obvious to him. And when many poskim argue that the times have changed, the Maharal says the spirituality of our universe hasn't moved an inch. And I think that is perhaps one of the Maharal's most interesting contributions to the way that we think about Jewish philosophy, which is that it challenges us to think about the relationship between Jewish philosophy and Jewish law. They're not just two totally separate columns. There isn't one halacha shir in the morning and a shmooze for Hanukkah in the afternoon. If you cannot weave the two of them together, you're probably missing a little bit of both. This is one of those areas. It's kind of ironic because the Maharal was not a halachic authority in the historic sense that we know. When he does write halacha, we almost certainly don't follow it. But at the same time, I think he challenges us to think about halacha in a more spiritual way than we normally do. And ultimately, as we've said many times, when Hasidus provides this revival of the Maharal's life, this is exactly why he's the perfect figure for them. Because it's not just about kosher or treif or mutter or usser, but Jewish law is about Jewish experience. Jewish experience without Jewish law is not Judaism. Jewish law without Jewish experience isn't either, right? You have to find some way to maintain them both, and this was the balance that he struck. I would just end by saying two things. First of all, I'm very grateful that we were able to do this together. It was obviously selfishly a very enjoyable pursuit for me, but it was twice as enjoyable to be able to share it with all of you for 2 months. And that was really a blessing. And I really don't take it for granted at all. But my last word is not about me, it's about the Maharal. This is my thought. I'll write it up a little later. According to the Maharal, which is so amazing. The whole purpose of human life is to maximize however much time Hashem gives you. That's what the candle is, right? You have a bowl full of oil, eventually you're going to run out. And the question really is how much light you can produce before the fuel is gone. So to me, one of the most interesting things about the Maharal that we should consider is that when the Maharal died, he, for the most part, disappeared. Right? A cherem here and a quote here, and Nathan of Gaza. We saw these interesting examples. And then somehow, 175 years later, he just reappears on the scene again. And that is the most remarkable thing about who he was, and especially because of the way that he saw the world. The fact that the Maharal's candle was extinguished and then somehow it was relit tells you something that he really was an incredibly spiritual person. So I think that the Maharal leaves us with a very high bar that is probably not so reachable, but worth aspiring to. And I hope that it challenges us not only to learn more about him, maybe Pesach time, we'll learn Be'er Hagolah, we'll learn a little bit more about his writings on Yetzias Mitzrayim, but I hope it challenges us to think more deeply about what it means to live a meaningful Jewish life, and that our pursuit of Jewish law and our halachic kosher life can be as meaningful as the life that he lived as well. So thank you everybody for coming. Stay tuned for future stuff, and have a great night.